Ready to roll?
Yep.
All right. So hopefully everybody out there can hear us. If you're having any troubles, just ping Kimberly and let her know if you have any technical difficulties. But first of all, I just wanted to thank everybody for checking in with us today. This is really exciting. We're going to be able to chat about a number of different things that are going on in the Hourglass world. And first and foremost is really the formal introduction of Tony Biagi. Now, Tony's been with us for a couple of years, but this is the first full flight of wines that we're going to have an opportunity to taste that will be Tony's brainchildren from soup to nuts. So he helped us finish the 2010 and 2011 vintage. Some of you were with us last year when we tasted those. But this is really Tony's handiwork. And so we're going to kind of talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk a bit about what transpired and why the transition at Hourglass. We're going to talk a little bit about each one of these wines specifically. You'll obviously notice that there are no Cabernets in this flight, which is kind of fun for us because we've built our reputation largely around Cabernet, and yet the Blueline Estate is a property that's planted to all 5 Bordeaux varietals. So we thought it would be kind of fun to feature some of the non-Cabernet wines from Blueline Estate. And then the very first wine that we'll taste is the 2013 Hourglass Sauvignon Blanc. So this is brand new for us, and I think one of the first things that Tony commented when he came in the door was, "How come you guys don't do a white wine?" And I said, well, if we were going to do a white wine, I wanted to stay within the Bordeaux varietal set because I think that makes sense for the Hourglass brand and also makes sense for Napa Valley, being a slightly warmer climate. Sauvignon Blanc does really well there. But Bob Foley never really liked making Sauvignon Blanc, and so we never did a white wine. And Tony came in and said, well, gee, I love making Sauvignon Blanc, so let's get started on it. And so I'm really excited about where we went with the Sauvignon Blanc program. Tony's going to talk to you more specifically about each one of these wines and what's unique about them and what went into making them, and he can talk now, having a couple of years under his belt, about the 2 estate vineyards we have, the Hourglass Estate Vineyard and the Blueline Estate Vineyard. But I think maybe what I'll do is start with a question that was emailed into us before we started, because I think that it's a really interesting question that frames part of the evolution and thought process that went into us making a winemaker change. And whenever you make a winemaker change, we've been working with Bob Foley for 15 years, so it's not something that you go into lightly. And there are a whole host of thoughts that you as a brand owner and vintner and so forth have to confront when you're thinking about making a change like that. So the question came from Steve McIntosh, and I'm just going to read it to you guys because I think that this is a very topical thing, and maybe some of you will want to tweet in or ask some further follow-up questions about this. But I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what my mindset was and sort of what Tony's mindset was when we first started talking about working together. So the question is this. It says, there's been a lot of discussion in critical circles about a return to balance in Napa winemaking, referring to backing away from some critics and sommeliers' decree of an overblown high alcohol style. From a consumer's perspective, though, the rich, opulent style has not only become synonymous with Napa, but also helped elevate the region in status on the world's wine stage. I'd love to hear Jeff and Tony comment on their own approaches relative to balance versus luxury. So what a terrific question, and what a great way to kind of lead in. So as we started this process of trying to evolve, trying to understand what is Hourglass and what is it, where did it come from, and what does it need to evolve into, and so forth. I spent a fair amount of time thinking about the evolution of Napa as a whole. And so I look at our evolution within a historical context. So what's Napa gone through over the course of the last 40 to 50 years in terms of overall style evolution? So you have the 70s and the 80s, and I'll try to distill this down so I don't spend 2 hours talking about this subject, but essentially you've got the 70s and 80s where you had a lot of people drifting into Napa Valley, picking up the bones of an industry that had been scattered about by Prohibition in the 30s, and started to reorganize a wine culture in Napa. Now that was done without a continuous pass down of historical winemaking knowledge. So those people who came in the 70s and 80s were kind of starting from ground zero. And so the European consultants that were here became kind of the go-to people relative to understanding technique and style. And what that meant was that a European mindset was largely being used to make Napa Valley wines. And so that became sort of the driving factor of the day. And then in the early 90s, you began to see a paradigm shift into a new style of winemaking. And that was, that model was broken open by people like Bob Foley, who was our consulting winemaker when we started, Bob Levy, John Kongsgaard, Tony Soder, Helen Turley, Dave Ramey, Heidi Barrett. So these were a handful of the winemakers that really kind of shattered the mold. And what they did was they pushed the ripeness envelope and started moving into the world of higher pH winemaking. So they crossed the 3.6 pH barrier, started making wines at higher pH. And of course that was a huge game changer. And I think that speaks to the beginning of our own evolution as a winemaker. So we were associated with Bob Foley, who was one of these transcendent mold breakers. And so we followed the pendulum swing from largely the midpoint out into the more ripe, opulent side of things. So if you look at Napa Valley in terms of the more traditional winemaking, you've got higher acidity, you've got lower pH, you've got lower sugars, meaning lower alcohols. You tend to have more red fruits than black fruits, more tanginess, less resolved tannin, a little more scratchiness to the wines. And as you start moving that ripening pendulum to the left, excuse me, to your right, the pHs will go down, pHs go up, the acidity goes down. Start moving into the black fruit side of the spectrum. You get more density, more unctuousness, more phenolic mass. The wines become softer and rounder on the palate. And we followed that pendulum swing from roughly the midpoint pretty far out to the right. About as far out as we would want to go. And of course we were tracking down the path that a lot of Napa Valley vintners were tracking down. And I think that when we got out to the furthest extension of that, I would say that that was probably in 2009. I felt that the wines that we were making at that point, though they were very high quality wines, were starting to become a little monochromatic. So the varietals were starting to taste pretty similar to each other. There wasn't as much distinction between Merlot and Cabernet as I would like, and there wasn't quite as much distinction between some of the vineyard sites as I would like. And as we broke that down and really looked hard at it, we realized that the sweet spot of our wines was a little bit right of center. And so as these wines were getting bigger and the phenolic mass was becoming more dramatic and more mouth coating, they were becoming a little bit more one-dimensional. And there are trade-offs in life. So as you're going out there to get this drama, we felt that we were losing some of the energy of the wine. Some of the acidity we were losing, and some of the minerality. So you're going to get energy from wine in two sources, either minerality or acidity. And so we really felt that we wanted to bring that, that ripeness meter back to a bit right of center. So we want to infuse these wines with more energy, more liveliness, to be a tensional balance to the rich, dramatic, bold fruit characteristics of the excessive ripeness side of the spectrum. And so Tony and I talked quite a bit about that whole spectrum and technically what we needed to do to achieve that goal of bringing things back into alignment and creating more layers in these wines. And this is one of the things that I was so excited about with Tony, is that he could express how to do that from a technical standpoint. And he's also a big fan of blending, whereas Bob had been a fan of more of the varietal expression from a specific site. Tony really likes to blend. And there are a couple other questions. George Haber had a question about blending. We can address that in a little bit. But Tony was really excited about being able to pull back on the ripeness meter a little bit, reinfuse more acidity and more liveliness, and essentially what we're trying to do is have our cake and eat it too. You know, I'm never going to apologize for swinging out here on the ripeness spectrum. I don't think Napa should ever apologize for that, because getting out there, you learn a tremendous amount about what the possibilities are. And this is, to me, one of the great things about Napa, is that range of possibilities is probably one of the largest spectrum in any winemaking region in the world. So I'm not going to apologize about going out here, but I didn't necessarily want to stay there either. So that was the kind of baseline for why we made the change, and it addresses some of this issue of this balance point. And Tony, do you want to? I know that you have a lot of thoughts about the concept of balance.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, in the end, what everybody forgets is, you know, you talk about alcohol, but alcohol is only one part of the equation.
Mm-hmm.
Truthfully, it's acidity. I think, you know, not only were the alcohols higher, but people were forgetting to add acid or even keep the acidities at a normal level. I mean, yeah, pHs were pushed over 4, you know, 4.1, and those wines tend to be more clumsy, more sort of cloying. Whereas, you know, I think that's the biggest thing we forgot, is that we were pushing these pHs and these TAs, whereas you can have balance, but you can have alcohol, but you need the acidity. And I think that's really what was lost. I mean, look, Chateauneuf-du-Pape was over 15% most of the time, and no one ever says anything about those wines being unbalanced, because there's acidity there, there's freshness. And I think acidity is really the point of what we have to look at. And, you know, we all went through it. I mean, the 80s was definitely, people forget the 80s. Some of you out there that are following us remember the 80s very well. You were there, George, I know you would be there. But the 90s were sort of like the antithesis of that. It's the exact opposite, where the 80s was lots of acid. There are food wines. It was TAs over 7.5 grams, you know, the pHs of 3.3, 3.4. These wines would take your enamel off your teeth. And so we were almost rejecting that, and we swung the pendulum all the way the other way. So now we're coming back to the center. You can push the limits of acidity, push the limits of ripeness, but you still have to look for balance. That's really what I think. People don't look at that enough. I mean, some of the 80s wines are gorgeous. Some of the 80s wines are now just hollowed out acid bombs. So we have to look at that.
I think for us, the holy grail is to try to mine that balance in between those polar opposites as well, and to try to, we don't want to throw away unctuousness and richness and density, but we want to be able to do that in a way that doesn't sacrifice liveliness and brightness and lift on the palate. And again, I spoke earlier about that tensional balance. I think tension is something that we should probably be talking more about as a wine culture and so forth, because you can have richness, and if you don't have a tension, if you don't have any energy to work against it, then you do drift into that monochromatic side of things. But if you have that counterbalance, I think you can have loads of richness, but you also have vitality and energy. And we found that minerality is something that both of our vineyards have in spades. They express it in different ways. The Blueline vineyard that we're showcasing today is an old riverbed. It's a soil series called Cortina, which is this kind of cobbly breakdown of anything from big boulders all the way down to little sandy particulate matter. And the plants do pick that up, and it will be expressed in energy in the back mid palate. You can taste a little chalkiness sometimes to these wines. And so that mineral concentration is something that we want to bring out and accentuate, again, because it provides this tensional balance to richness. So, Tony, why don't we...
I have some questions too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Just a follow-up from Wine Anthropology. Says thanks for the comprehensive answer. Understanding the swing is in its infancies, what are your impressions of where you are on the spectrum of the 2012s? And I've got several other questions.
Tony, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, again, people, I think so. Do you want me to talk about where we are on the spectrum of 2012 from Wine Anthropology? Again, people forget where we are in the world viticulture. We are southern Italy, so we're always going to be a warmer climate. We're always going to have higher alcohol levels. A lot of the wines from the 70s and 80s, it's one of those things, don't ever believe everything you read on a label. Sometimes people like to lie about the alcohols, heaven forbid. So we tested some of those 70s Cabernets, and they were over 14. Number one. Number two, the viticulture was so different at the time. Leaf roll virus was rampant throughout Napa Valley to get grapes ripe. But then you talk to Andre, I can never say his name, Chelichev. But the reality is that he was picking at 27 to 30 bricks back then, and I've heard people time and time again who've interviewed him say this, and he watered back, And so people were picking ripe back then, and that's really what made the BV George Latour's wine so special in the 70s. And people like Philip Tognan, they were picking riper then, and also, but the leaf roll virus played such a big part in it. They couldn't get grapes over 23 bricks at times. Plus, there were bushes. Cabernet in general wants to be a bush. It doesn't want to be trellised. It's Sauvignon Blanc is very similar to that. So I think we're always going to have alcohols that are over 14, but really it's a matter of looking at the acidity and how those wines are balanced. I think the 12s are a great start for us. I love the 12 vintage, 12 and 13 vintage are two miraculous vintages back to back, very similar to 1 and 02. But I think you could taste the tension in the Merlot, the vibrancy of the acidity in Malbec, and then the Franc is very much, got the classic sort of Franc-y. Jeff says tar, I say a little bit more, green tobacco, and so forth. So I'm really happy where they are. I think the wines are really showing good freshness and good acidity at this point.
I think it's actually a testament to the 12s are a testament to Tony's skill level and our ability to have these open dialogues between the two of us and talk back and forth about stylistically where has Napa come from, where is it going, and where do we want to sit on that, and then be able to work that through from a technical standpoint. Tony is a great student of the history of winemaking in Napa Valley, which I think is fantastic because he clearly has a modernist perspective, but it's informed by a traditionalist's sort of toolkit. And I think you find those two things winding themselves together, and that's one of the reasons why I was so excited to be able to work with Tony, is to blend these two energies together to try to find that sort of center point. So from a vintner's perspective, knowing the history of Hourglass, where it's come from, I'm really excited about these wines because I think that Tony has articulated in each one of these wines, they're clearly differentiated from each other. I think that they're very precise. I think they're highly articulated. The Merlot right now, for example, our Merlots because Merlot is an early ripener and Blueline is a slightly warmer site, Merlot can run on you really quickly in that vineyard. And so in some previous vintages, it had really bulked up and it had been really unctuous and dense and rich, and in some cases maybe even a little sappy. And what I love about the 2012 Merlot is that you get the black fruit richness, but there's also this incredible sour cherry characteristic to it that gives a tanginess and a vitality to it that I think is really fantastic. And then the precision of the aromatics on this wine, to me, as you build phenolic mass and density, Tony and I were talking about this on the car ride down today. When you build that mass, sometimes you sacrifice the aromatics because that phenolic mass has a tendency to wind up some of the esters. And so what I love about this is you get these incredibly fresh, vibrant fruit characteristics and almost a kind of a mandarin orange peel, that oily peel with it's a low-tone citrus, not a high-tone citrus. And I don't think that you would get that level of nuance out of a couple of previous vintages of the Merlot. So I think the Merlot really expresses this precision in a beautiful way.
A couple other questions. UC Bo up in Oregon says he loves your acid head, Tony.
No.
And, because he wants to know how much of the stylistic shift is climate change versus modern science. and technology versus critics versus winemakers?
Can they hear that?
No, that's why I asked.
Okay,
So that's a long one. Can you do that one again? That's an easy one.
How much of the stylistic shift is climate change versus modern science and technology versus critics and winemakers? So that whole soup.
How much is our style change directed towards critics, climate change, and modern winemaking? In the end, you have to believe in what you make. I mean, I can make, I don't think anybody survives in this business. I mean, you can get a paycheck, you can, that's fine. But if you truly want to be successful in this, you have to like what you make. You have to believe in what you make. I think anybody, whether it's wine critics or consumers, can sniff out really quickly if you're just doing this for a paycheck and you're doing it to follow somebody. I believe that California is a riper terroir. Let's say Bordeaux. I mean, Bordeaux is equal to Washington. It's equal to British Columbia, whereas we grow Cabernet in like southern Italy. So you're going to get riper flavors in doing that. I mean, this is very, I'm a maceration head. I really try to make, I believe that all the wines should be made all the big decisions should be made before fermentation. If you can make the wine before fermentation, you shouldn't touch it after. Because I mean, fermentation is the most violent. Fermentation in general in life is one of the most violent actions that can happen in nature. So after that, anything you do, if you add a little bit of acid or you do this or that, it should be covered up by the fermentation itself. Anything after that is basically remediating a problem you created during fermentation. So as winemaking, I don't want to do anything after. I want to put it in barrels. I want to add a little bit of sulfur. I want to keep it clean that way. Climate change, I mean, everybody says global warming. I say global weirding. I just think that in the end, we've seen 2011 was the coldest vintage in 60 years in Napa Valley. So explain to me, riddle me that. I mean, who knows? And 10 and 9 were also very cold years. It was the first year we saw rain during harvest. It's weirding though. We see different things every year, and I think over long periods of time, I have to be honest, do we take good care of the earth? Absolutely not. I think we'd all agree to that. But this sometimes happens over epochs of time, not eras of time. I don't think we've seen anything different in my 25 years there. I mean, we're in a drought right now, but we were in the drought in the 70s. Yeah. 76, 77, 78 was a drought years too, so that's almost 40 years ago we're talking about. We're seeing the exact same cycles. California's very cyclical that way.
We see a weird weather pattern, we instantly go, oh, it's due to global warming. Well,
we live in California.
The reality is,
that's the truth of the matter.
The reality is that we just don't know, and we won't know for a long time.
We'll know when we know.
There are actually some pretty interesting arguments that Napa will cool if global warming continues, because the interior valley, Sacramento Valley of California, as it heats up, will pull more fog further inland. So there are all kinds of different theories about what will happen. The one thing that doesn't get discussed in the environmental impact discussion is our ability to counteract and react to situations. So there are plenty of farming techniques that are evolving and will continue to evolve and change and so forth that give us tools to react to Mother Nature, and we're doing that all the time. So it's not a straight line between global warming to higher alcohol wines or more phenolic wines or whatever. It's a lot more complicated than that, and I think that Tony spoke most eloquently about the issue of style needs to be something that you as a winemaker or me as a vintner feel very passionately about. And if you do that and you have the right sites, you're probably going to make really killer wines regardless of the style. And this is one of the things that is so cool about Napa, is that stylistic range is incredibly wide. Mm-hmm. So you can kind of go anywhere on that spectrum you want to go to. That's your choice as a winemaker, as a vintner, and so forth. So we choose, here's Napa as a terroir spectrum, and then we make the choice on that spectrum and that style. Mm-hmm. So what we're trying to do right now is to find that holy grail for Napa Valley, or excuse me, for Hourglass, which is a little bit right of center in terms of where the ripeness should land.
And modern techniques, I mean, the only thing I think that I can add to that is that now more than ever we're doing a lot of research during the maceration time for the wines. Your wines are made during maceration, how much color, how much tannin, and all those different things. But we're manipulating the fermentation. We're not adding chemicals. We're not adding extra enzymes or anything like that. We're really fermenting. we're looking at the maceration temperatures and techniques and the length of the time of doing that. I don't believe in spinning cone. I don't believe in those things. I try to make the best wines possible during fermentation and do that stuff and try to pick the right sugars. I think a winemaker, you ruin a wine 2 times in its life. You ruin it at bottling and you ruin it during harvest. So, I mean, you really need to be present at those 2 times. Other than that, racking and blending, you can ruin them at blending too, but for the most part, it's really bottling and harvest is when you ruin the wines. So
yeah.
Okay.
Should we go back to?
Sauvignon Blanc.
Should we end with Sauvignon Blanc or go back to Sauvignon Blanc?
Let's do Bordeaux. Let's go to the end of the white wines.
All right, so we're gonna do reds first and then finish with
right? Freshen everybody up at the end of the night, cook dinner stuff. So.
Second wine in the flight, 2012 Blueline Estate Malbec. So we planted Malbec before Tony came on board as a blending component for.
Oh, Merlot, sure. Let's talk about Merlot.
Well, you had said Merlot, then Malbec, then Cab.
We just tasted Merlot.
I'm sorry, you
did we?
Pardon me. I didn't think you did.
What did everybody say? Did we taste Merlot?
Okay, I tasted Merlot. I don't know what the hell you guys did, but
He's the boss.
All right, sorry.
So Merlot. It's funny. I cut my teeth. George Caber asked a question about blending, and I cut my teeth at Duckhorn Vineyards. That's right. I graduated from Davis and went to work at Duckhorn, and I think everybody out there would say, name 2 wineries that are known for Merlot since the 70s. It would be Schaefer and Duckhorn. And so Merlot kind of became my baby. I mean, I got to know it very well, and I learned to hate it for a while because that's all we did at Duckhorn. But this area where we are at Blueline, Dan Duckhorn believes in that area. That's the backbone of most Duckhorn Merlot. He owned probably 100 acres in that area, so I got to know the area real well. Very ripe, very opposite. It's across the street from Three Palms. So we know Merlot grows well there. I mean, Rick Foreman approached us, Jeff and I, at a party and told us for about an hour how much he loved this property for Merlot and how he tried to buy it in the 70s and 80s. So that was pretty exciting to hear. And then Barbararo said the same thing about a week later to me. So obviously the property's pretty special for Merlot. 20-year-old vines. No, George, this gets into the blending session that you were asking the question. It's funny, Duckhorn was always, they were a big Bordeaux house. I mean, Dan Duckhorn went to Bordeaux many times, Tom Rinaldi went to Bordeaux many times, and so I sort of learned at their knee that all 5 varietals, or 6 if you want to include, or 7 if you want to include Saint Macaire or Carmenere in the blend, they belong there. In what proportion, that's up to us in any given vintage. Bob, for some reason, a lot of the winemakers in Napa Valley didn't believe that. Bob Foley likes 100% varietal wines. Nils Vengi, who I took over for at Plumpjack when I worked there as the winemaker, believed in 100% varietal wines as well. Where Jeff and I see eye to eye is like, you have all 5 varietals, why wouldn't we use them? That's a crazy question. And Merlot, Duckhorn Merlot's always blended with Cabernet. And then once we learned Petit Verdot and Cabernet Franc, those wines went in as well. So Jeff had all 5 varietals, so let's play with it. Now the Franc doesn't normally make it into the other wines. It's a very special standalone wine with a very small amount of it. But we did plant another block recently, so we're going to have more freedom to put Franc in the Cabernet and the Merlot in the future. As we know, in Saint-Emilion, Merlot and Franc, and Saint-Emilion especially, Merlot and Franc go hand in hand. So this is 91%, so I'm going to say 92%, 91 or 92% Merlot, the balance being Cabernet and Petit Verdot. Off the top of my head. 91, 7, and 2, correct?
Correct.
So about 50% new French oak, but that site is just such opulent Merlot. We did 4 passes, which is something different that Jeff and I talked about. We try to get a pass that's a little more fresh and crunchy, we like to say, almost like a pomegranate seeds, crunchy. Then I think the last one, it's almost like overripe plum. And we sort of put them together and create blending that way. That was something brought over from Plumpjack.
So it's not only varietal blending, it's also lot blending. So kind of taking a different approach at each one of the blocks that we have out there, breaking them down into multiple passes. And going back to something that I spoke about in the beginning is this sort of spectrum of ripeness. On the left side, you've got more of the red fruits, the tangy red fruits. On the right side, you've got more of the unctuous, black, sweet fruits. And you can step through a whole sequence of fruits in that.
I would say almost like Hoisin. The Hoisin area of Merlot. And again, blending is everything. I mean, the blends change every vintage, and what's so great is we have all 5 varietals on site.
And this has been an interesting learning lesson for me, in that, I've had now the privilege of working very closely with 2, classic, iconic winemakers, but each with their own kind of perspective. And Bob used to prefer to do his blendings at the tail end of the aging cycle, and so we would keep all of the component parts together. And Tony likes to blend just after malolactic fermentation, or at least start the blends right after malolactic fermentation, so very early in the process. And this was a hard adjustment for me because I'm a control freak and I love to see everything in their component parts until the very end, and then you want them together. But Tony sat me down and said, "Now, listen, there's some huge advantages to early blending," and Tony, you can speak to that. But I think that these wines have a level of precision that excites me, and I think part of that may be how you approach blending.
Yeah, again, where I learned this from, again, was, Duckhorn blended late, so it's very different. But when I was at Plumpjack, we put the wines together very early, and it's something we started in. I look at Bordeaux. I mean, we're making Bordelais wines, and I think sometimes I often chide Jeff and I chide my friends that, we make Bordeaux wines. I mean, Cabernet is the father of the left bank, Merlot being the right bank. But yet we take a view of Burgundy in Napa Valley. So we keep all these separate lots for 18 months. So we have, our one block which we treat like Riche or Romy Saint Vivant. Then we just slam them together at the end and call it a day. But in reality, those lots should go together earlier. It's like stew. The longer the stew, and everybody knows stew tastes good the next day, not the day you make it. And I think the longer the wines can be married together, the better they're going to taste. That's why Bordeaux can make 10,000 cases of Chateau Latour and it tastes phenomenal. And for years, Napa Valley's had a hard time understanding that. I think we're sort of at a crossroads between, do you want to make Burgundy 150 cases of something, or do you want to make an estate-driven wine that's 1,000, 2,000 cases? And that intrigues me. I mean, 150 cases is not that interesting to me. I think if you can make a site like Blueline, we were talking to today, Blueline's 25 acres. Or 12 hectares, the size of a small chateau in Saint-Emilion. And can we make 2,000 cases of Blueline Cabernet sing? And I think that's the sort of way you do it.
That's harder to do than making 200 cases.
Right. It's very easy to make 2,000 cases and pick 200 cases out of it. So we blended early, and I think it makes better wines, more complete wines. Because one wine might have the aromatics come March, one wine might have the tannin, and you put it together, but that wine that has great tannin or great aromatics might fall apart over time, but if you put it together with a wine that has lots of color and tannin, it actually elevates it up. And I think the longer you keep an onion by itself, it tastes like an onion. The longer you keep an orange together, it tastes like an orange, or a stew. The longer you keep stew components separate, they still taste like components. The more you put it together, the more it tastes like stew, and it's an amalgam of its parts. So.
Just a couple, another question.
Yep,
Two
sure.
questions from the same person, Wine Fashionista. Just when Tony gets a moment to sort of talk a little about the arc of change of the wines at Hourglass with your winemaking approach versus what you saw with your predecessor.
Sure.
And also a question from Mary as well about Malbec, why on its own?
Okay, so go ahead.
So the first question, I'll address the first question, the Malbec question first. So why Malbec? Why a standalone varietal? And our intention was not to create a standalone varietal. We planted Malbec. And you guys can jump into tasting it if you haven't already. We planted Malbec as a blending component to Cabernet and Merlot. We planted it in the lowest flat section of the Blueline Estate, which is the most gravelly and most sandy of the soils. And for some reason, those sandy soils seemed to push the Malbec more in a tangy red fruited direction than a black fruited direction. There's still plenty of black fruits in here, but there's a little
25% Petit.
Yeah, so
Petit Verdot.
There's Petit Verdot blended in here, and that black fruit is really coming more from the Petit Verdot. So that tanginess that you get, that's kind of strawberry, raspberry, and a little bit of the grapefruit rind characteristic. That's all coming from the Malbec, and we thought that was really cool and really special, and nothing like any of the other wines we've ever made. And therefore, we thought maybe this should stand alone. We do use Malbec as a blending component on some of the other wines, but we make about 50 cases of this. It's mostly direct to our mailing list and so forth. As a little special cool thing for being associated with us on the mailing list, but we just thought it was really cool. And
yeah, and not to mention the fact that what I found out about Malbec is all the 5 main varietals have a place in the blend, and I worked with Malbec at Plumpjack. They actually planted 2 acres of Malbec at the estate of Plumpjack. I wanted it for the simple fact that it tends to not want to get riper than about 24.5. The phenolics will ripen enough. You'll get tons of color out of the skins. You'll get great tannin, but you don't get the alcohol. I mean, this wine right here, I think, is barely over 14, and that's only because of the Petit Verdot that we put in it. Whereas our 13 blend is, I think, 13.9. But yet it adds a ton of density and richness. And see, everybody thinks alcohol is what we were shooting for. We wanted more alcohol. We wanted to get our tannins right. We wanted right phenolics. The tannins coat your mouth. And that does come with higher alcohol levels. So what's so great about Malbec is that you can add it to the wine. It lowers the alcohol, but you still get density and richness. And so, I mean, I think this wine's barely over 14.1.
It's 14.2.
Yeah, on the label, yeah.
And that 14.2 is 14.2.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's,
and that was the Petit Verdot, but we bumped it over. I bet the wine itself, Malbec was probably 13.6 or 13.7. That's why I love it. And it's very unique. It's one of a kind. It's a very fun variety to work for. Not every year does it get ripe, though. 12, it stood on its own. We didn't use quite a bit of it in the blends. I didn't think it worked well in the blends. 13, it's everywhere. It's in our Blueline Cabernet, it's in the Blueline Merlot, and so it's just vintage by vintage, but that's Bordeaux, left bank, the best vintages Petit Verdot works. In other vintages they don't use it, but in the best vintages they always use Petit Verdot at 2 to 3% if they have it. So that's just sort of the vintage specifics. And then the other question was change of predecessor. I think is how I'm making wines differently than Bob. Look, when I went to work for Jeff, I told him this very, very openly. I said, we're not trying to take the engine out of the car and buy a new car. All we're going to do is give it a new paint job and change the wheels. The winery was doing quite well. It was just more precision, trying to get more precise in the vineyard. I have the utmost respect for Bob Foley. He was not a sort of a roundabout mentor. We all tried his wines. All my young guys who are now winemakers, we all went out and found Pride Mountain wines and the early Switchback Ridge wines, the Hourglass wines, to see what he was doing because he was such a leader. But again, it's more precision, it's more hands-on, it's just more focusing, and it's a lot of blending. All 3 of these wines here have other varietals in them. None of them are 100% anymore. If it's gonna, if it's gonna be 100%, it will be. But we always give it the opportunity to try to blend. So.
Speaking of that, good follow-up from Enobites. How would wines differ in taste when blended early versus later?
Go ahead. Yeah,
well, no, just so they can hear.
Yeah.
So the question was, how do wines taste when they're blended? How do they differ when they're blended early versus blending late?
It's a good question. I think that it's a personal preference of what you want. I think the wines are more complete. I think they become more of its own entity. Whereas when you blend them later, they tend to be a little bit more shocked. They don't tend to come because you got to think if you're blending late, you're then bottling them 2 or 3 months later, and so you're throwing them in a bottle. They've only been together 3 months. I think they tend to be tasted a little bit disjointed. Whereas you blend them early, you then do 3 or 4 rackings. You're marrying them all the time. You're remarrying them, remarrying them, remarrying them. So I think they just become more complete.
My observation now in sort of seeing both styles is that there is a tighter center core, a more classically structured center core, and I think part of that has to do with blending earlier. And to me, this is something that's, I think, really exciting, is to have wines that have, when we're trying to find this sort of holy grail moment with wines, we talk a lot about, when we're doing the blends and so forth, we talk a lot about how the wine is centered on the palate, how it's structured, and does it have a tight center core to it that's well knit together. And if you can achieve that piece of the puzzle, then I think that you've got wines that are going to age really well over a long period of time. And then from that point, if you have enough options in the cellar, and this is one thing that I love about Tony, is that he's making a number of different styles of wines using the same blocks that we have, and setting that center structure, and then having more pieces of the puzzle to be able to add layers, add some baby fat around that center core. So I think that the center core is something that I look to. Tony speaks about the precision and this goal of trying to really mine in and make wines that are highly articulated and very precise. And I think that to me relates back to setting structure. And so how does the tannin structure work? How does the color and the tannin relate to each other? And I think that those wines together if you get them,
Yeah.
get them blended earlier in the cycle.
And I think it also allows you to make varietally correct wines. I think if all of you out there, you're tasting all three wines side by side, I fail you guys as winemaker if the Malbec tastes like the Merlot tastes like the Cabernet Franc. You know, they all taste the same. You know, that's my death knell. If you're out in the marketplace pitching wines to a restaurant, and the buyer says, "Oh, they all taste the same. Just send me that." I mean, I failed as a winemaker. So I mean, the Merlot I think tastes like Merlot. The Malbec tastes like Malbec, and then I think the Franc is definitely Francky.
No question.
So you know, so I think that's my goal. I think blending earlier allows you to accomplish that.
More questions?
Question from James Melendez. He's honored that you opened the Cab Franc and asks, why is it your marquee wine?
This is from James Melendez. So why is the Cab Franc our marquee wine? So I personally believe that it is our marquee wine, at least so far. Tony's got another couple of tricks up his sleeve in the 2013 vintage that we may be having some fun with, because he's done some really cool little blending things there. But thus far, I think Cab Franc has been, in my mind, kind of the rock star of the Blueline vineyard. That vineyard is ideally set up for Cab Franc. It's the Cab Franc is planted in right next to the Malbec in these gravel beds. It's a slightly warmer site. Cab Franc needs a little bit of warmth, and it needs a long growing season to be able to translocate the pyrazine out of the berries, so you don't have that green weedy characteristic.
You go from three bean salad, you know, asparagus to, I like to say, Franc can give you asparagus to gunpowder to Flint to, you know, you go from Loire Valley Cabernet Franc to Saint-Emilion Cabernet Franc. Big window.
Yeah.
I tend to like more Saint-Emilion Franc. I mean, I told Jeff when I came here I wasn't a believer in Franc. I know, sacrilege, but it's green. I mean, you know, that's, you know, you talk about, I think all of you know, that's been the push away in winemaking, get away from the green flavors, get away from the green flavors. Whereas now I think the marketplace is accepting more and more, accepting. Maybe the average consumer has become more educated. I know I have. The internet's a powerful place to buy wine, and so I tend to love this block. It's 23 years old. It's eastern facing, so it gets a ton of sun. So
it's on those gravel soils.
But this has 11% Cabernet in it and 6% Petit Verdot. So Clone 4 Cabernet, one of our older blocks, and some Petit Verdot.
And we will still, and some of the vintages will express a little bit more of the pyrazine character. But even in a cool vintage like 2011, where you would think that you would get pyrazine jumping out of the nose, and it would be, you know, it would just be all about underripe green bean salad and so forth. Even in a vintage like that, it has a little bit more of an herbal characteristic, kind of an herb de Provence, which I find actually quite attractive. It's not a distracting pyrazine characteristic. And then in riper vintages like 2012, when we don't have a whole lot of the herbal characteristics, now you're getting a little bit more of the floral characteristics.
Yeah, violets and tar. I'll talk about a little tarweed.
Little tarweed, little violets, and this is. There isn't a lot of coffee aroma showing right now, but when we were going through some of the malolactic fermentation, you pop the bung off the barrel and it was like you were in a Starbucks or something like that. It was just all coffee and pretty
And the good news is, like I said earlier, we planted another acre of Franc on the property. Jeff was funny. We pulled a block of young Merlot that was underperforming for us, and we tea-butted it over, and Jeff's like, "Well, what are you going to do with it?" I'm all, "Well, the good news is if it doesn't work in the Franc, we can actually blend with it." He's like, "Oh yeah," forgetting that we blend now. So I'm really excited about this new block of Franc. It's going to start coming online this year, and it's going to enable us to make a little bit more Franc for the marketplace, as well as giving me the tools to blend into the Cabernet and the Merlot. So I mean, I think Franc now, I've come to the conclusion, you know, they call it a donut wine. It's got a big beginning, big end, and no middle. And so I think
that's why Merlot is classically blended with it to fill that hole.
It's the fat on the skeleton. So, but yet I don't find this wine being that way. Even 100% Franc is not that. It's a very dense, rich Franc. This is some of the older clone budwood that came into Napa Valley. So I mean, it was planted 23 years ago, so 24 years ago, 1990. So that was probably clone 1, clone 2, probably sourced in Loire Valley, but just a great site for it.
Yeah, the site's pretty rocking for it.
Tony, wine fashionista, how do you minimize green flavors in Cab Franc if you get a cooler year?
You hang it longer. I mean, how do you manage green flavors? You let it hang longer on the vine. And that's, again, that's sort of, you know,
If you can.
If you can, the longer you hang it, the more alcohol you could potentially get because the sugar goes up. So, you know, it's basically the methoxypyrazines are in the grape skin. You know, Cabernet Sauvignon is the child of Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Franc. So both Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc tend to be very vegetal. I mean, you've had, you know, we like to say kitty piss and Sauvignon Blanc. I'm sorry, I know it sounds bad, but I think we all understand what that means. From the New Zealand style all the way to the wet stones and marmalade of white Bordeaux or even Napa Valley. Well, Franc can be the same thing. Franc goes from green beans all the way to Flint. So I think, you know, you just gotta let it hang, but then you get more alcohol.
Yeah, really the only way to get pyrazine out is through time and heat. And so,
sun on the skins.
And so site becomes, and solar radiation. Site becomes absolutely critical in terms of Cab Franc. So if you want to make a more modern style of Cab Franc that is less green and more on the floral side of the spectrum, more on the flinty side of the spectrum, and you have it in a cool site, you know, you're just toast. There's nothing you can really do about it. But if you like that particular style, then a cooler site is going to deliver that and so forth. So I think in both Cab Franc and in Sauvignon Blanc, there's kind of this fork in the road where warmer sites are going to take you into the more floral side or the more fruit side or the more melon side of the spectrum. And the cooler sites are going to take you into the more weedy, green perspective.
And the eastern hills is where Franc grows. I mean, Ars or eastern. Then you have Ovid, you have Dalla Valle Maya, which is the classic blend of Napa Valley. It's been, you know, since 1988, half and half Franc, and you know, but they're getting them right. You know, Oakville Ranch. You tend to look at those warmer sites that really can cook the green out. So.
Jeff, would you mind answering more detailed Gazelle's questions on your sheet there? Just to kind of
Dizelle had asked the question, can we speak about what makes the Blueline site so special? And that from last year's tasting, there was this deep richness and pure, rich fruit flavors, yet wonderful acidity framing the fruit. I think that to me is why Blueline is so special. It's in a slightly warmer pocket, or the northeastern side of Napa Valley. It's about 2 miles south of the town of Calistoga. And if it was not planted on the gravel wash soils, I do wonder if it would be as special as it is. My suspicion is no. And my suspicion is that because it's a slightly warmer west-facing eastern vineyard, that you would get more sappy, overripe, dense characteristics if you weren't careful about how you farmed it, and if it didn't have the gravel beds that underpin the vineyard. And I think it's the gravel beds that underpin the vineyard that are really the backbone of why that vineyard is so special.
I think the breeze too.
That's actually another really good point.
You know, making wines at 3 pounds for Duckhorn and so forth. You know, what we have is the Chalk Hill Gap blows into our mountain and the wind comes down the hill, cools the vineyard down in the afternoon, whereas once you get out to the valley floor, that breeze, you know, it's rifled through our block, but yet it goes out and it just opens up, and so the power of that breeze puts us in less. So you can see our vines moving pretty, you know, very favorably in the afternoon, whereas you go to the valley where Three Palms is and it's still. And I think that really,
which is literally across the street. Three Palms is, you know.
But because it's so tight where we are, and then it just opens up so quickly, you get this almost rifle nature of wind.
You get so there are 2 canyons that rise up above the Blueline site, and there's a thermal dynamic that draws air across that vineyard. So, there's a slight cooling effect that you get because of that. Plus, you're also getting a lot of motion of the canopy. And I think that you're getting better sun penetration into the canopy itself, so that has an impact on ripening. And then the minerality that you get from those soils, I think, is a tensional energy balancing point that's really important. So you get a buzz on the back mid palate in some of these wines, and that is more a mineral thing than it is an acid thing. So the acids are going to get you on the tip of the tongue and the sides of the tongue for the most part. And if you're getting a tickle and a little buzz in the back mid palate, that's going to be more associated with minerality. And I think it's that minerality that helps. The acids aren't really high in these wines, and yet they're lively, they're bright, they've got some lift on the palate. that's coming from someplace, and we speculate that that's really being driven by the minerality of the site. So again, creating that tension between having this really rich density of pure fruit and then having it explode on your palate.
I'm thinking it might be good, no one's asked this, but to talk a little bit about the higher pH winemaking.
So a question about higher pH winemaking. So this goes back to the earlier question about balance and so forth. We'll frame that by saying, you know, in the 70s and 80s, most of the winemakers coming out of Davis were trained by Maynard Amarin, and who, Tony, you've probably read a million of his treatises and so forth. He wrote most of the primary books on winemaking that trained most of the first generation Davis winemakers. And I've read some of his, although I'm not a trained winemaker, I've read some of his work. And you know, he used to say things like, you know, never ever ever make a red wine above 3.6 pH.
I mean, he'd get in fights with Ralph Kunke about ML fermentation in red wines. He said that's a spoilage. You shouldn't do it. You know, the wine should never go through ML. Now everybody does it in Napa Valley. I mean, it's just.
I don't think we've ever made a wine. Tony, you may have, but I don't think we've ever made a wine. You know, below like a 3.7, 3.75 pH.
I think we shoot for about 3.6 to 3.9, somewhere in that range. You got to remember, every step above, it becomes more exponentially higher. You know, I think what is it? It's 3 to 4. I think every time you take a step up in pH, it's 100 times more acidic or 100 times less acidic. So every little increment matters, and so. You know, I mean, Syrah in general likes to be over 4 pH. There's nothing you can do about it. So a lot of those wines age really well. I mean, you're looking at, that's even Hermitage, that's even Côte Rôtie, you're looking at 4.1. But, you know, you really have to pay attention to that. I mean...
So Tony, let me ask you a question. So that they can get a good perspective on this. Maynard Amarin was suggesting that you keep your pHs below 3.6 for stability purposes and so forth. But what happens when you cross over above 3.6? What happens phenolically? What happens tannin-wise? What happens color-wise?
Let's talk about a little bit of everything. I mean, number one, you risk. I mean, the dark ages were the 60s and 70s. No one knew what they were doing, and granted, there was a lot of messes. I mean, there were diseases in the wines, or not diseases, but like flaws in the wines that don't even exist anymore. Like, you know, this sounds bad, but we've eradicated diseases in the world. It's the same thing in winemaking, with clean, precise winemaking. So, but that now, you know, again, the questions were asked, there has to be a better way, you know. So we realized that dumping, you know, 50 pounds of acid in every tank. I worked at a winery once that I put 120 pounds of acid in one tank, and because we had to get the pH to 7, you know, so the TA to 7.5 grams, and get the pH to 3.4. I mean, I'm looking at the winemaker, are you driving me crazy? You know, we had 5 bags carrying them up, and there we went. You know, it's amazing how much acid you can melt in hot water. I learned that the hard way. You know, it's pretty amazing. So, get the water hot enough, you can do 150 pounds in a 50-gallon brew. But you know, what happens is the pH gets higher and higher and higher. The mouthfeel gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You go from bright, the wine goes from bright cherry red, and you start getting more blue and purple hues to almost brown. And again, you know, the 90s, and even the 90s really was the beginning of this. You know, a lot of us young winemakers are coming on board, working for other people and asking these questions. Then you have someone like Helen Turley, who I have the utmost respect for. I don't care what anybody has to say. She's probably one of the most powerful winemakers of the last 50 years in this valley, and it's given everybody the opportunity to ask different questions. You know, do you want to make natural wines? Go do it. It's because of her. You want to make proper wines? Well, she's giving you the opportunity to do so. But she was pushing the limits of pH. I mean, she was at 3.9, 4, and of course we all chased it like little dogs. We don't want to be like that.
But there are massive changes in the web that is wine chemistry as you hang fruit longer. So tannin is changing very dramatically, color is changing very dramatically, acidity is changing very dramatically, and a whole host of very complex chemical relationships are being keyed off by breaking this 3.6 pH barrier and starting to hang fruit out longer to be able to achieve this. And so this is the paradigm shift that I was speaking about earlier. And that paradigm shift changed a lot in Napa Valley, and in fact it changed a lot in the world. And so those people who broke that pH barrier, the Bob Foley's of the world, the Helen Turleys of the world, so on and so forth, those people took incredible risks, and they were very real risks. I don't know that they get enough credit for breaking that barrier and pushing out there and experimenting, because what they were being told at the time was stability is a huge problem when you go out there. And stability is an issue that you have to keep in mind. The flip side of that is there's all kinds of other incredible microbial stuff that's going on.
That's everything. That's where you
that we didn't know about. So setting tannin to color, which Tony has educated me about, is maybe one of the most important relationships in winemaking. And you would never know how to do that if you didn't crack the 3.6 barrier and go out there, because you just never would develop that much color. So I mean, we could spend hours and hours and hours talking about what it means to make wines in a higher pH environment. So instead of doing that here, why don't you guys come visit us in the winery, and we'll hang out with you and go deep.
It's a hard question. You know, it's not a question that's answered in a 5-minute interview. I mean, it's just
Next Brandlive.
Yeah,
See, next Brandlive. You do one Brandlive just on that
It's a
subject.
philosophy. I mean, it's hard to explain a philosophy in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So.
But we still have one last wine to taste.
We do, and also lots of food questions, just people
Okay.
asking what you and Tony would pair with these wines.
Okay.
So
Let's finish up with Sauvignon Blanc,
I need a little more. Maybe I'm gonna sit with that.
and then we can talk food and wine pairing if you like.
Sure.
So Tony asked, well, how do you want to approach Sauvignon Blanc, and we kind of came to we tasted a lot of Sauvignon Blancs, and we came to the conclusion that we wanted to make the white representation of our red program, which is again trying to have great mouthfeel, unctuousness, richness on one side, and a tensional balance of energy on the other side. So acid and minerality on the other side. So Tony,
it's so funny because, you know, I love my red wines a little more opulent and rich and dense. You know, I like to push the pH a little higher, 3.7, 3.8, maybe 3.9 even in some instances. The Sauvignon Blanc's the exact opposite. I like acid, and so the pH here is 3.3, the TA is 7.5 grams. Lots of freshness. Definitely like that, you know, and taste a lot of Sauvignon Blancs in California that we liked. In the end, you know, I made Sauvignon Blanc, of course, at Dufford and a CADE winery as well. So this is all native yeast fermented, a little bit of new wood. We kissed it with some new wood, with the balance of old Burgundy barrels. We really wanted to have the freshness, and I think we're seeing pineapple husk.
yeah, pineapple. There's some honeydew, melon characteristics. What I like about this is that, you know, when we were talking earlier about cool climate, warm climate, as it relates to Cab Franc, and as it relates to Sauvignon Blanc. So we wanted to go down the slightly warmer climate spectrum of things so that we could get to the melon and fruit, the pure melon fruit characteristics, and that wet stone character, and then we also wanted some vibrancy as well. So I think, Tony, you knocked it out of the park as far as first time out of the chute with the white.
Yeah, and I'm really happy with it. I think it's really refreshing, it's dense, it's rich. I mean, the perfect world, if we can find a little Semillon in the next couple of years to blend in there. I love Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc. It's not easy to come by anymore. Vince Toffanelli sells some great Sauvignon Blanc right down the street, or Semillon right down the street, but everybody wants it. So play those games. And maybe he'll give me a ton. I bought fruit from the past. But
Sauvignon Blanc is a really killer white wine for Napa Valley, especially in the upper Napa Valley, which is where we are.
I think it's the sister. I mean, it really does well. If you can grow good Sauvignon Cabernet, you can grow good Sauvignon Blanc.
Well, and Sauvignon Blanc will hold its acidity a little bit better than Chardonnay and some of the other whites that don't perform very well in
some of the best
warmer
Sauvignon
climates.
Blanc. I mean, look at Araujo's in Calistoga, and some of the best Sauvignon Blanc in Napa Valley. I mean, Freddie Andi's got great Sauvignon Blanc. Vince Toffanelli's in Calistoga as well. It's a great area for white.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So yeah.
So the Giants are 0-0. Do you want to talk about Bruce Bochy liking Hourglass?
I don't know how many Giants fans we have in the audience. Maybe we'll save that one for later.
Okay. Cool. All right, we are just about ready to wrap up.
There were question about food and wine pairings?
Yes, thank you.
Anything in specific?
No, just truly what you would enjoy, particularly towards the Cabernet Franc. what you might want to pair with that?
One of the strangest phenomenons that I will say so far is that when Tony and I go out and have a meal together, we almost always order the same thing. So I wonder what that tells you about how our palates are calibrated.
We order the same wines too.
And we can order a lot of the same wines, absolutely. One of my favorite pairings would be, because I just love Cab Franc so much. I think Cab Franc has the ability to pair unusually with fish. And so I sometimes will do a steamed sea bass where I will steam the sea bass with a little bit of rose water, same kind of stuff that you would use for cocktail making, and just put a little cap full of rose water in the water and steam it in that, and it brings out that floral side of the Cab Franc, and then top it off with a little miso butter. So just take a little miso powder and fold it together with some unsalted butter and just kind of melt that on top.
Jeff's an awful cook.
Pretty yummy.
That's exactly what I would do. I was just going to tell you where I'm whip that up. So.
I don't know. What else?
You know, again, it's such an old cliche. I'm a big pork guy. I always, I love pork and pork tenderloin.
Brined pork.
We're very lucky here. You have Lee Hudson down the street where I buy a pig from every year, and we get pork chops from him, and it's fantastic. Just brine some pork chops up with that, with a little bit of wilted spinach, just perfect.
Yeah.
Spinach, it tends to be a little bit strong, but I think that greener flavor goes pretty well with Franc, so I think it's too bad.
Another thing I like to do with the Merlot is to do an Asian style spare ribs.
Oh, that sounds good.
So take the spare ribs and slow cook them with, I do it differently every time, but it's mostly soy based with a little garlic and brown sugar, some shallots, a little rice wine vinegar, and slow cook them. And the thing that I love about pork spare ribs with an Asian glaze is that the sweetness of the pork isn't obliterated by a heavy sauce. So you can really taste the meat, and I think that pairs really well with the sort of mandarin orangey characteristic of the Merlot. You guys hungry yet?
Yeah.
It's dinner time.
Anything else?
I think we answered everybody's questions.
Perfect. Well, thanks everybody.
Yeah.
And please come visit us if you get a chance. We'd love to have you guys. You guys know how to get in touch with Kimberly, or just call us or shoot me an email or Tony an email. It's Jeff at Hourglass Wine and Tony at Hourglass Wine. And if you guys are in the neighborhood, we'd love to geek out with you and take how much of
Talk more
time
about
you want.
pH.
Yeah.
Bore you.
PhD.
pH and TA. It's everything.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.